There are few writers who have captured the Kurdish experience of nationhood, exile, heartbreak, love and oppression as profoundly as Bachtyar Ali. He is widely regarded as the most influential Kurdish novelist of all time. Yet he is more than a literary figure. He is a voice of freedom, of conscience, and of democracy in Kurdish society. To recognize him only as a novelist is to overlook his larger role as a moral and intellectual force. Born in Sleman in the mid-1960s, Bachtyar Ali came of age amid revolution, war and dictatorship. The collective memory of these experiences etched into his writings, where the tragedies and dreams of a people are revived not merely as history, but as a means to keep the human conscience awake. When I met him, he told me he had not given an interview like this in 14 years. That's why I thought it best not to speak at length about his novels, or even about Kurdistan itself, but rather to connect both his work and our society to the great dilemmas of all time: the crisis of meaning, the resurgence of reactionary and far-right forces, and the encroaching presence of artificial intelligence. Does artificial intelligence now occupy our inner lives, leaving little space for imagination and creative writing? I met Bachtyar Ali in a house overflowing with books, the German city of Wuppertal, where he lives surrounded by literature. Until that day, I had thought of Wuppertal only as the city of the famous suspended railway I had long wanted to see. I did not know this city would also lead me to meet one of the greatest novelists and thinkers of all time. Here in Wuppertal, in the birthplace of Friedrich Engels. Hello and good to see you, Mr. Bachtyar.
Thank you, and welcome here.
Thanks a lot for accepting the invitation and hosting us.
My pleasure.
After so many years, this is the first time you are sitting down for an interview. Now you are doing it with a Kurdish media outlet, published in English and from Germany. Let's go back to the beginning of your youth, when you first started writing during your high school days, or when you were already at university. For you, was writing something essential, something that came naturally, or was it more of a reaction to Baathism and oppression? Recently, I came across Alain de Botton, who says that writing is a way of taking revenge on the past he has lived through. And Slavoj Žižek talks about how in moments of deep depression or even thoughts of suicide, writing can turn into a form of salvation. So for you, what was writing? Was it a refuge where you could escape and give voice to beauty, loneliness, love? Or was it more a response to the oppression faced by the Kurdish people, or even to the struggles you yourself went through as a young man?
Every text carries within it a kind of pressure on the world, or you could say it's a form of resistance against the world. But at a deeper level, writing comes from a strong, hidden desire to truly understand reality, to uncover it. We often assume reality is something simple, something obvious just there in front of us, but in truth, reality is made up of very complex layers, and at first glance, you never see the most important dimensions of it. One of the striking things about reality is that its most powerful and influential aspects are not immediately visible. That's why we need tools to reach those dimensions and layers. And one of the most powerful tools we have for exploring the darker corners of reality, or for shedding light on them, is the process of writing itself. From the very beginning, this obsession with understanding and seeing reality has been one of the main forces that pushed me toward writing. But of course, we were living through an era of dictatorship and war. The number of wars my generation witnessed is not easy to count. We've witnessed so many different ones. Under the dictatorship, most voices, most dreams and hopes were silenced and suffocated. It was a generation that constantly moved back and forth between life and death, a generation that couldn't see any real horizon for the future. And one of the greatest things dictatorships destroy is a person's voice. the ability to speak, to express oneself, to tell one's own story and reflect on the world. Dictatorships kill all of that and reduce those powers in people to almost nothing. For me, writing became a tool to bring back those silenced voices buried inside me, and maybe inside society as well. There was a cry within us, not only within me, but within the whole generation. That cry needed expression, and writing became the most powerful way to give it shape. Additionally, I was also a reader. From the beginning until now, reading has been a great source of joy for me. But reading is, to some extent, a passive act. Whenever you read a book, you want to say something between the lines, to ask a question, to take something away, or to add something new. So, moving from reading to writing was really a shift from being passive to being active. And in those years, that activeness was very important to me, because it was also a search for self-identity, both as a young person and as someone who wanted to stand against a harsh, oppressive world and offer a kind of resistance.
بۆچی لە ناو کۆی ژانرەکانی نووسیندا بۆن منە بە شەعر دەست پێ کردووە؟ Why did you first start with poetry before moving on to novels? Do you think narration can help heal traumas, or does it actually bring them back to life so that neither a people nor an individual can ever forget them? ئەم زەبرە دەرونیانەی لە ڕابردوودا لەبیر نەچێتەوە.
ڕاستیەکە تەماشا بکەی ئەدەب خۆی هاوارێکە بۆی ئەو ئازارانە لەبیر نەچنەوە.
Literature itself is a cry to ensure those pains are never forgotten. Literature doesn't help us erase catastrophes. On the contrary, through literature, you try to keep those cries, those deep fears within history alive, and to give them a voice. One of the most important roles of literature is that it teaches a kind of conscience. It takes us back to historical moments that might otherwise be forgotten, silenced, or never shown to us in their true form. Literature brings us back to those places and those same historical conditions that might be long neglected. That's why reviving the voices and the cries of the past is such an essential part of what literature does. One of its greatest tasks is to bring back to life those historical voices that might be forgotten for so many different reasons. But I usually make a distinction between two kinds of memory: collective memory and literary memory. Literary memory may be the place where much of the real human pain and experience is preserved. From Immanuel Kant, we know that memory is not simply an archive of images or a few souvenirs or a store for some particular senses. On the contrary, it is an active space. It functions not only as remembrance, but also as a kind of what I describe as ideological apparatus, because memory selects. It holds on to certain images, feelings, and details from reality, but it also leaves other things out. So memory is both an act of remembering and an act of forgetting at the same time. That is why it's so important that a writer should not rely only on memory. Of course we write, and writing may help us endure fears, pains, or what you call trauma. In some ways, it can be healing for traumas. But that is only one side of the process. And the deeper side is the literary dimension itself. If we want literature to be truthful, it has to be more than memory. Memory is often shaped by ideology. For example, Ba'ath regime personnel had their own memory of the Anfal campaign, very different from the memory of the victims. Memory can hold some things tight while pushing others out. That's why, if we want a text to really reflect its time and historical events, we need something beyond memory.
لڕاستی تێکستێکی ڕاستەقینەمان هەبێ کە ئەوێنەی سەردەمەکان ئەوێنەی ئەو ڕووداوە مێژوویانە بێ هەمیشە پێویستی من بە زیاد لە یادەوەری هەیە.
کاک بەختیار هەمیشە ئەدەبیات ڕوبەڕووی کۆمەڵێک هێزی دەرەچی بۆتەوە.
Mr. Bachtyar, literature has always had to confront external forces. It has always faced challenge from political powers, from social changes, from religion, and even from technological advance. From religious authorities in the past to today, the rise of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence has already created a kind of crisis in scientific research. Before, you needed 6 or 7 hours to sit down and write a research article. Now AI can generate one for you in just a few seconds. Literature has survived so many challenges in the past, from the attacks of religious and political forces to the persecution of writers, and later the rise of new technologies. Cinema, for example, was born out of literature, yet at the same time it created new competition for poetry and storytelling. Social media has done the same. But today, literature is under the shadow of artificial intelligence. Now you can ask AI to compose a poem or a novel in the style of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, or in the style of Bachtyar Ali, or even Shakespeare, and it will produce it instantly. So my question is, can artificial intelligence bring an end to literature, or could it actually become another challenge that pushes literature to grow even further?
I'd like to give a slightly longer answer to this. At some literary conferences I've attended, what most writers fear is not so much that AI will take and use their works. Much of what AI produces in literature is actually drawn from the material of writers themselves. So, one of the questions now linked to writers' rights is how to protect their work and prevent it from being used by artificial intelligence. The situation has an almost comic side. One Russian writer put it beautifully when she said, "We actually need AI to do our dishes and clean our homes so that we can sit down and write, not the other way around, where AI writes novels and poems while we do the housework." But at a deeper level, AI raises fundamental questions. Can it replace human beings? Has it created a new existential condition for us? These two questions are very important. Let me start with the second one. Has AI created a new condition of human existence? Without a doubt, the answer is yes. If we look at human history over the last 4,000 or 5,000 years of civilization and building our cities, humanity has always stood before two great forces. One is the divine, an unknown, unseen power we question but never fully understand. The second is nature, which is itself a great factory of questions. Everywhere we look in nature, it's full of mysteries we've had to seek answers to. Now, for the first time, we are facing a new kind of consciousness, what Zizek calls bodiless intelligence, and what Sloterdijk refers to as subject without subjectivity. We are now confronted with a pure intelligence that can answer almost all of our questions. Whatever we ask it, it responds, and then it can even answer the next set of follow-up questions we put forward. But the real question is this: can artificial intelligence ever become an alternative to human beings? In my view, the answer is no. No matter how powerful AI becomes, no matter how much its intelligence surpasses ours, or how much smarter it appears, there are certain things in human relationships that AI simply cannot replace. Zizek points to something very important that he calls symbolic depth. When you and I sit down together, we're not only communicating through words. Every gesture, every smile, every frown, all of the small movements and silences, they all play a big role in our conversation. And it matters that I know the person in front of me is a real self, with a unique character and identity. You know the same about me. But when you interact with a machine, it doesn't recognize you as a subject. It only stays within the limits of exchanging words. I write something, and it sends back words in return. The whole world of color, of body language, of hidden and layered meaning that shape human communication, that world cannot exist in dialogue with the machine. A more important point is that no form of artificial intelligence can ever reach the issue of knowledge and ignorance. Recently, I was reading an important essay by Elias Canetti, written back in 1942, where he talks not only about the importance of knowledge, but also the importance of what we do not know. Every time we gain knowledge, every answer we reach opens up an even greater sea of unanswered questions. In other words, as the space of knowledge expands, so too does the space of ignorance. There is a parallel process between knowledge and ignorance. With AI, we can only feed it what we already know, but we cannot give it what we do not know. And it is often this mysterious and uncharted territory that stands at the heart of science, literature, and other fields in life. This is why I don't believe AI will replace writing or the writer, because the real source of writing is not just information or cliches. It also draws on many other elements of human experience that are deeply tied to the personality of humans. Take the visual arts as an example. Look at the paintings of Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Albrecht Dürer, or Caravaggio. On the technical and artistic level, they are flawless and perfect, capturing the tiniest wrinkles, the smallest shades of light and shadow, all with astonishing precision. But in contemporary art, creating a perfect imitation of reality no longer carries the same value. With someone like Matisse, you might see only a few lines, a few colors. Maybe you can call it a human figure, maybe not. Maybe you see colors arranged in the shape of a vase or something else entirely. What I mean is that artificial intelligence can certainly create a beautiful and eye-catching painting, but it cannot create a Chagall, a Modigliani, or a Pollock. That is because those artists had their own unique vision. Their work was not only about painting technique, it was also tied to deeply personal human dimensions. So my point is, yes, AI is a very powerful form of intelligence, but in literature and art, we don't rely only on intelligence. We also rely on the body, on instinct, on imagination, and on dreams. I don't believe we will ever reach a stage where AI can truly replace human beings, or replace the writer or the artist. AI may be one artist among other artists, but it will not erase art. It may be one writer among writers, but it cannot erase writing, because writing is deeply connected to how the self interacts with its subject matter, with society, with its surroundings. If you look, for example, at Iraqi literature, the work of Muhammad Khadir in Basra is not the same as Hussein Arif in Suleymaniya. The work of Jalil Qaisi in Kirkuk is not the same as Shirzad Hassan in Suleymaniya. Literature is always shaped by the intertwining of a person with their environment, their society, their history, and their specific era. This is why the literature written in Russia could not be later written in France. Therefore, AI may imitate writing, but those unique qualities inside a text, the marks of a human life and imagination, are very difficult for AI to ever reach. It can simulate writing, but it cannot take the place of writers in the most essential places where literature is born.
ئاماژە بە خاڵێکی زۆر گرنگ کرد لە مەسەلەی کە ژیری دەستکرد ناتوانێت داهێنەر بێ وەکو ئینسان وەکو نووسەرێک.
You have made an important point that AI cannot be a creator in the way a human writer is. But at the same time, we have a kind of nostalgia for classical literature. Our awareness and imagination have been shaped to admire Shakespeare, or as Kurds, Goran, while for Arabs it might be Najib Mahfouz or Mahmoud Darwish, and for Germans, Schiller. Today, though, a new generation is being shaped alongside this virtual world that technology has created. Even the way young people speak has been transformed by these advances. So while we may still find joy in classical or modern writing, perhaps in the future a new generation will find joy in text produced by artificial intelligence. Because it is true that we can experience love, instinct, trauma, and suffering, since we have the ability to put ourselves in the place of others. But AI, in a way, can reach every mind and every world. It may never become Shirzad Hassan, as you mentioned, but once it has access to his novels, or yours, or any other writers, AI can instantly reproduce something that resembles their voice. That's why some writers, like you, raise the question of creativity. Will the creativity AI presents to a generation growing up in a virtual world ever be the same as the creativity offered by a human writer like yourself?
لەو دنیای ڤێرچوالە گەورە بووە. هەمان داهێنانیە کە نووسەرێکی خۆت ئاسا پێشکەشێکا لە داهاتوودا؟
بە بڕۆی من نەم. لەبەر چی؟ لەبەرەوەی یەکێک لە هەرە سیفەتە گرنگ و گەورەکانی هونەرمەندە گەورەکان و نووسەرە گەورەکان و تێکستی گەورە بەگشتی قدرەتێتی لە دەستپێکردنەوە لە سفر.
I don't think so. One of the most important qualities of great writers and artists, and of great texts in general, is the ability to begin from zero, from a point of origin. As Margaret Duras once said about filmmaking, I like to begin from zero. That process of starting from scratch often appears in poetry. It is a way of turning language back to a stage before words take on the familiar meanings we use in everyday life. Almost a return to language before its social, scientific, or literary functions. This force exists within literature, within human imagination itself. For example, why is someone like Chagall important? Because when you look at his paintings, you feel that the entire culture of painting before him didn't play a decisive role in how his canvases came to life. Or take Paul Klee, as it appears on that painting behind you. He sees churches in that particular way. Only after careful searching, you discover 2 or 3 towers hidden within the lines. This is a way of seeing the world that returns images back to their point of origin. That is something artificial intelligence cannot do. A great writer or creator can. They can start from a place that has never been touched before, a true beginning. AI cannot create that kind of originality because it always works with the material we provide, producing a kind of sophisticated imitation. So yes, AI can be a powerful imitator, but to start from nothing and bring into being something that lies beyond everything humanity has already made, that is an extremely difficult task and one that belongs to human creators. In fact, the generation you're describing may one day come into being, but such a generation would be a tragedy, because it would be a generation that can only connect with machines, not with human beings. When I go to an exhibition, I don't go to just look at lines and colors. I go to see the inner world of the artist, their doubts, their strengths, their weaknesses. With artificial intelligence, much of this disappears. At first, it might even be hard to tell whether a text or a painting is the work of a human or a machine. But the deeper you go, the more you realize you're dealing with something that only works with material already given to it, not with a being that expresses its own experience. The most important thing in literature and art is the ability to express those hidden depths, the inner worlds that can only be spoken through symbols and metaphors. And I believe AI will never reach that place where human beings, through their own existence, can go.
زیرەکی دەستکرد هەرگیز ناگاتە ئەو شوێنە کە مرۆڤ خۆی ئەتوانێ بیگاتێ.
Mr. Bachtyar, you spoke earlier about the progress of civilization. With technology, humanity has achieved remarkable advance. At one time, the average lifespan was only 40 or 50 years. Today, it can reach 90 or even 100. That's true not only in Germany, thanks to economic, social, and technological progress, but even in places like the Kurdistan region of Iraq. But with these advances, civilization has also brought serious problems. Climate change, for example, or the huge inequalities in the world that people like David Kreiber or politicians like Bernie Sanders describe as the 1% versus the 99%. According to data from the US, after the COVID-19 pandemic, around 48% of families had to cut back on food. Friedrich Engels once said that from the first day to this, sheer greed was the driving spirit of civilization. So the question is, as we now stand before the most advanced technologies, with artificial intelligence and a world beyond imagination, is humanity really winning? Or are we, alongside these advances, creating deeper problems like climate change? And if we look at mental health today in the US alone, the industry around therapy and treatment is worth over $100 billion. So do you think, with all these developments, humanity is truly advanced, or are we actually producing new crises alongside our progress?
بە بەڕای من مرۆڤ لە مێژووی خۆیان هیچ شتێکی دروست نەکردو دوودی و نەبێت هیچ شتێک لە چقۆیەوە بگرێکە بە بەر دروستی کردووە تا ئاگەینە سەر زیرەکی دەستکرد هەموو دیاردانی کە مرۆڤ دەسی لێوەیەوە هەمیشە دیاردەی دوودی بوون.
In my view, throughout history, humanity has never created anything that did not have two different faces. From the stone tools our ancestors made to today's artificial intelligence, everything we produce carries this duality. Perhaps this goes back to human nature itself. We're beings in search of comfort, happiness, and peace. Yet at the same time, we're also being driven by power, domination, and self-interest. As creatures with this dual nature, whatever we create inevitably reflects it. Take Adorno, for example, when he talks about the Enlightenment. He says it was a process of stripping the world of its magical illusions. But at the same time, it was also a project of control and domination. Through the Enlightenment, we learned to explain things that once seemed like magic, to give scientific interpretations instead. But the very process of enlightenment was never free from the desire to dominate. So, as Adorno puts it, most of what humanity produces, the work we do, the tools we build, always carry within it an effort not only to understand, but also to control both nature and human beings themselves. We're living in a world where the most frightening side of modernity and development is growing bigger every day, and we feel it more. With every step forward, the darker side of progress becomes more visible. Development itself has turned into an uncontrolled process. In such a world, a person is created who no longer has the capacity to see that process clearly. To understand the dangers of progress, we need the ability to see the past, the present, and the future all at once. Without this panoramic vision, without placing our present moment within a broader horizon, we end up living only in the now. And when we live only in the now, the logic of profit dominates over the logic of reflection. Today, companies are racing to extract the maximum and quickest profit from people. One way they do this is by pulling us deeper into digital and virtual spaces, turning us into creatures trapped in the present. This kind of human being starts to replace natural desires and dreams with artificial ones, replacing authentic needs with manufactured wants. They live only in the present, unable to clearly see the future or the dangerous outcomes of the moral path humanity is currently on. This obsession with the present and disregard for the future is one of the greatest dangers facing our world today. The problem is not that no one is raising their voice. People have been warning for centuries about the risks technology brings, and thousands of books have been written about it. The issue is that still the logic of the market and profit are stronger than the logic of protecting humanity and nature. The absence of such a morality is, in my view, the greatest threat facing our civilization today.
The morality you talk about, has it disappeared, or is it, the writer Brian Klaas argues in his book Corruptible, that the tendency toward corruption is part of human DNA? He described it as a long story of human development and survival. But let me ask more directly, is it really in our DNA to want to control and dominate others? Is the drive for power stronger than the search for happiness? Because today we see that more than 1 billion people cannot get access to drinking water, while on the other side of the spectrum, we no longer just talk about billionaires, we are entering an era of trillionaires. So my question is, in human nature itself, in our very DNA, is the instinct for survival tied to a deeper instinct for domination, greed, and control? And if not, then why is it that at this stage of human progress, we still see the same hunger for power and wealth that we saw 5,000 years ago?
I would like to go back here to one of Judith Butler's theses. I think she's one of the most important philosophers of our time. When Butler speaks about how the self is formed, what in philosophy we call the subject, meaning character or personality, she says it is created only in relation to power. In other words, what we call character is always shaped under the influence of power, within its gaze and through the interaction with it. From the moment a child is born, they enter a large web of power. Inside this web, the child learns how to speak, how to behave, how to feel, and how to keep clean, what is considered good and what is considered bad. This web of power grows with time and its rules become stricter. Moreover, human character, as Althusser would put it, is in many ways a response to what he calls the call of power. Even the very word personality in our society is usually given to those who adapt themselves, who fit into norms, laws, social morals, and expectations. Such people are called people with personality. What is important in Butler's thesis is that this process is not natural. It is historical and socially constructed. Human beings do not behave as they do by nature. They are trained within a specific culture and time to think and act in a certain way. And the fact that it is not purely natural but shaped by history and society, it is the only hope and a huge silver lining in front of us. That hope lies in imagining alternatives and creating new ways of being human. This means the destructive, beastly side inside us is not 100% natural. Through culture, education, and different forms of upbringing, we can create a different kind of human being, one where that fascistic, violent force inside is not active.
ئەو ماشێنە فاشیستی کە لە ناویایەتی ئەو دڕندەی کە لە ناویایەتی ئەکتیف نەبێتە.
In relation to that, in the 1990s, there was a moment when, after the collapse of the socialist bloc and the rise of neoliberalism, many claimed that history had reached its end, that liberal democracy was the final stage of human political development. For a while, that narrative seemed convincing, but eventually it collapsed as well. Now, we see that even liberal democracy itself is in deep crisis. As Habermas puts it, it faces a crisis of legitimacy, a crisis of its very values. From Trump to Erdogan, from Nigel Farage and Brexit in Britain to our own region, the model of liberal democracy is under serious strain. So, how can we think about an alternative, even if alternatives may feel distant or difficult to imagine? How can we, alongside with Judith Butler suggests, that since everything is socially constructed and not purely natural, find ways to resist and to struggle for something different?
If we go back to Nietzsche in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he describes humanity as a rope stretched between the animal and the higher human being, a rope stretched tightly across the abyss, with the beast at one end and the higher human being at the other. To be frank, if we look at history, the dreamers of great visions, people like Nietzsche or Marx, imagined progress toward that higher stage. But what we see now is that the beastly side has returned even stronger. What Marx once called the choice between socialism or barbarism turned into a tragedy, because socialism itself was born already dying. Under Stalin and the systems that followed, it became part of the very barbarism it was meant to resist. Today, we live under capitalism, and capitalism is a massive machine. It is a machine that cannot switch off itself, a system that continues to run endlessly. Yet more than ever, we need a new logic. A logic that can control the market, that can place limits on human exploitation of nature, and that can slow down the progress we are seeing now. In reality, capitalism cannot redesign itself, and because of that, it has started a more frightening process, the redesign of the human being. This means shaping people in a way that fits the needs of capitalism. Even our dreams, our desires, our fears, and our judgments are being manufactured. The modern human is constantly subjected to pre-programmed instructions through vast systems and institutions, political directives, endless consumerist desires, so on. None of these come from natural human needs. Instead, they produce an artificial person shaped to match the logic of consumerism, of capitalism. And from this emerges a human being who, to some extent, is aggressive, who leans towards racism. Many of the racist trends we see in the world today are not accidents. They grow from within the system itself. It is not merely a matter of intellectual unrest among some people, nor simply a misguided project. It has become one of the products of our age, manufactured inside the cultural machinery of capitalism. All of this is a serious danger for humanity. If we ignore it, society may slide into a deep and destructive collapse. It might not happen today, but in 10 or 20 years, relations between nations, cultures, and communities could reach a point where dialogue and coexistence are no longer possible.
Let's turn to our own region, the Kurdistan region of Iraq, and the wider area. After 2003, we experienced a huge encounter both with globalization and with neoliberalism, which came to us through the US invasion of Iraq. At first, there was a phase of democratization, but in my view, that phase ended somewhere between 2011 and 2013. If you go back to Gramsci's famous line, "The old world is dying and the new cannot yet be born," that was exactly the moment we entered. As you mentioned earlier, it was the time when monsters were being born. In Kurdistan, we started out with big dreams. In the early 2000s, there was real momentum: independent media, an active opposition, public debate, civil society organizations, serious conversations about women's rights, about separating powers, about the environment. But today, it feels like the dream of democracy has ended here. The dream has shrunk so much. I remember when you used to write in Awaken newspaper, our conversations were about what kind of democratic system we wanted, how we could secure social justice, how to guarantee women's rights and protect the environment. Now, all we talk about is salaries. So my question is, isn't this shift to talking only about salaries a sign that democracy has reached its end?
If we look at this more broadly and return to Gramsci's idea of the old and the new, we have to ask, what exactly is the old and what should the new be? And on what foundation can we speak about democracy? In my view, the old is that period when groups, whether political, national, or religious, built themselves within closed forms and identities. Each identity group drew a wall around itself, and any contact with others was either impossible or built on fear. This is still the case in much of the Middle East. Political, social, and national groups remain closed inside their own traditional forms and are not ready to open up to others. But the essential condition of democracy is exactly this openness to the other. Emmanuel Levinas says democracy, at its core, is when I recognize that I am myself and you are yourself, and you are entirely different from me. Then I accept your freedom to be different from me. I do not want you to become me. The moment I want you to become me, or the moment you accept becoming like me, democracy disappears. Democracy means accepting the other in their full difference, even if there is no common ground between us. You still have the right to live and to express yourself. For me, to some extent, that is the essence of democracy. In societies where identities are constantly in conflict and remain closed, we see what Amin Maalouf calls deadly identities. In such a world, building bridges between different groups and identities is almost a myth. And so, creating democracy in these kinds of societies also becomes close to a myth. What these societies often produce is not a free individual who can think and decide independently, but a person who is a follower, a dependent, tied to their tribe, their party, or whatever form of identity they belong to. A real democracy requires a human being who is able to encounter others, to accept them, to see their beauty and differences without feeling threatened or wanting to erase them. That kind of vision requires a very different culture. But in a society that cannot critically examine its own internal processes, democracy cannot take root. A society that cannot create free and independent individuals cannot create a democratic order. And when power is concentrated in the hands of a small group that can manipulate every aspect of social life, democracy is impossible. This is what we see in Kurdistan today. We have a set of fascist-style cantons, each controlled by its own leader, many of them with a military character, relying on force, intimidation, and terror in every form, from symbolic to physical. This is the reality we face in our society. So when we talk about democracy in a society where power has never really been separated, it is meaningless. In such societies, power is always collected in the hands of a single dictator. Even if those dictators seem small or local, within their own communities, they play the same role as a larger dictator, suppressing rights, silencing people, and ruling through fear. And in a society where the judiciary is not independent, it is simply impossible to talk about democracy. What we see in Kurdistan, and more broadly across the Middle East, is a set of closed groups, each with its own fascist-style military power, holding on to entire spheres of life. The role of the human being in this kind of system is reduced to almost nothing. If you compare this with capitalism in the West, there's a difference. Western capitalism was historically built on production. Humans had a place in it because human labor and creativity were central to the accumulation of capital. But in Middle Eastern capitalism, capital does not come from human work. It comes from oil, from easy revenues, not from taxes. And in such a system, the human becomes secondary, almost irrelevant. That is why it is so easy to build systems that give no value to human life. What we see in Kurdistan is a system where life and death are treated as the same. If people go 4 or 5 months without receiving the only income that puts bread on the table, and the state shows no concern whether they survive or not, then you realize you are living in a system where the value of the human being is at its absolute lowest.
In your earlier comments, you touched on the question of whether building a democratic society requires an aware of conscious public or whether it depends on good leadership. For example, both of us live in Germany, and we know that after World War II, a large part of German society was transformed into a democracy. This was not only because of the will of the people, but because Germany's political, military, and economic elites sat down together and realized that they could no longer continue with the same fascist order that had led to 2 world wars in 30 years. They decided they had to move toward democracy. And under good leadership, democracy took root. Of course, in East Germany, things developed differently. In Kurdistan, since 1991, we have always had this debate. Do we need an enlightened and aware society in order to establish democracy, or do we need a leadership that genuinely believes in democracy and can guide political process in that direction? As Friedrich Engels, the first elected president of Germany, once said, democracy needs Democrats. So the question is, how can we make democracy stick in Kurdistan? Even if we somehow cultivate a democratic society, can democracy really survive without political elites who are committed to it? How do we navigate this dilemma in Kurdistan?
لە ڕاستیە جیاکردنەوەی جەستەی سیاسی لە جەستەی کۆمەڵایەتی یا جەستەی دەسەڵات لەگەڵ کۆمەلگا زۆر کاریشی زەحمەتە چونکە
In reality, separating the political body from the social body is very difficult because they're so tightly bound together. What we call society is itself the outcome of how power functions and grows within it. That is why society is never something apart from the structures of power it produces, and why it always requires a long, ongoing struggle to transform and reshape its culture. You mentioned Germany. After the Second World War, intellectuals there played a crucial role. Think of Group 47, with figures like Günter Grass, Martin Walser, Ingeborg Bachmann, Henrik Böll. They were powerful critics of the Nazi tradition that still lingered inside German society. Without a very different kind of education and cultural effort, it is extremely difficult to cultivate democratic individuals within a society.
زۆر ئەستەما لە ناو جەستەی کۆمەڵایەتیە بتوانیت مرۆڤی دیموکرات دروست بکەیت.
Sorry to interrupt you, but in our own society as well, after 1991 and again after 2003 when Iraq was freed, or rather invaded by the United States, our intellectuals also had conversations. They spoke about how to build democracy, how to create a system different from the old Ba'athist order.
Look, Mr. Kamal, if you want to produce a conservative person, you don't need to do anything special. Society itself, from childhood onward, shapes people into conservatives. In the family, in the neighborhood, in daily life, a whole set of traditional values is poured into people. So when a conservative organization begins to act, the ground is already prepared and people are ready to follow. But if you want to create a new kind of person, someone with a new perspective, a new language, a new worldview, then you need a very different kind of education. Within the old traditional worldview, everything is already set up to produce people who are anti-democratic, which is why in Middle Eastern societies like ours, you don't even need powerful propaganda machines to manufacture conservative individuals. The cultural system already does that. Most of our cultural and media institutions produce conservative people, not people with new values, new morals, or new ways of thinking. That's why raising a new person requires a radical cultural shift. You mentioned the post-Saddam period. If we look at why the opposition in Kurdistan was largely unsuccessful, it's partly because it lacked the ability to generate a new worldview. Compare this with the 1968 movement in Europe. Politically, that movement failed. They didn't seize power. They didn't achieve major political victories. But because they brought with them a new system of values and ways of thinking, those cultural shifts managed to enter society and leave a lasting mark. Even today, many of the moral and cultural changes of 1968 remain alive in European cities. So the condition is not just about seizing political power. The real condition is whether you can plant a new worldview inside society. When you have an opposition that talks about change but has no real definition of what change means, that talks about freedom but cannot articulate what freedom actually is, then in that absence, it becomes very difficult to claim that society and power are two separate bodies. In reality, the two are intertwined and reinforce each other. That is why, without a radical and deep cultural transformation inside society, there will never be a radical transformation within power itself. Look at the Arab Spring. Look at the concept of revolution in Iran, or the many social movements in the Middle East in the second half of the 20th century. Almost all of them ended up producing conservative outcomes because they failed to generate new people and new ways of thinking.
تا ئەندازێکی زۆر بسوونەوەیەک نەبوون مرۆڤی نوێ بەرهەم بهێنێ بیرکردنەوەی نوێ بەرهەم بهێنێت.
Mr. Bachtyar, I still have many questions, but since our time is limited, I will ask a few quick questions. I'd like you to answer them in just a word or a short sentence. What's the best novel you have ever read?
ئەتوانم سێ ڕۆمانت پێ بڵێم ڕاستیە زۆر زەحمەتە یەک ڕۆمان بۆ منە.
It's hard to name just one, so let me give you three. I've read so many great novels, but these three have stayed with me the most. The Idiot by Dostoevsky, 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie.
And among your own works, which one is your favorite and why? I should add, I personally hope it's not the last pomegranate tree of the world, because for me, that book was the one that opened my eyes the most to the politics of Kurdistan and the reality we lived in.
کوردستان و ئەو دۆخی کە ئێمە تێداژێن ڕاستی دوامین هەناری دنیا بۆ خۆشم کتێبێکی ئازیزە بەڵام
To be honest, the last pomegranate of the world is very dear to me. It has been translated into many languages and has tens of thousands of readers, maybe even hundreds of thousands around the world. So, of course, I feel a strong connection to it. But if I were to say which of my books feels the most important or closest to me right now, it would be Daniel's Clouds. Because in that novel, the theoretical line of my work and the literary line truly meet. It deals directly with the rise of fascism, with the transformation of ordinary children and young people into fascist characters. This is the central theme of Daniel's Clouds.
If you were not a novelist, what would you have liked it to be?
I think I would have wanted to be a filmmaker.
What's something that really makes you sad?
A lot of things.
Give me one example.
Being cut off from reading and writing makes me deeply sad. If for some reason I go through a week without being able to read or write, I fall into a very deep kind of sadness and uncertainty.
What's that keeps you awake at night?
You know, we're from a generation where even as children, when we went to sleep, we would always hear the sound of gunfire, of RPGs, of bombs. In my childhood and youth, there were very few nights without the sound of weapons. Many times we slept through bombings. So over time, we developed the ability to fall asleep in any situation.
And what annoys you the most about people?
When people talk with full confidence about something they know nothing about. Unfortunately, in our part of the world, you often see people speaking with absolute certainty, but what they're really expressing is confidence in their own ignorance.
If you could change one thing about yourself, what would it be?
Every life we live is really just one choice among many possible lives. If I had the chance to choose again, maybe I would choose a completely different life. But if you mean within the frame of the life I have now, then honestly, I would say I haven't shown enough mercy to my eyes. I wish I had been kinder to them. Read less, spend less time in front of the computer. Day by day, I feel my eyes growing weaker.
Mr. Bachtyar Ali, thank you very much. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I am sure our viewers and readers will be delighted as well.
Thank you, and I hope so.
Dear viewers, listeners, and readers, this brings us to the end of our interview. Please visit our website, theamargi.com, and follow our pages and accounts on social media. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Until next time, take care.